Today is the 5th day of the month of Teves, and we are in the middle of chapter 35, discussing the laws of Challah. Today we'll be finishing the chapter, doing paragraph number 8 and 9. We will begin chapter 36, discussing the laws of salting meat. In chapter 6, we'll be doing paragraph 1 through paragraph 10. So chapter 35, paragraph 8. The job of taking off Challah falls upon the owner of the dough. The owner of the dough could appoint someone else to take up Challah. They could say to the friend, could you take up Challah on my behalf? But they have to make that appointment. The friend can't take up Challah without the explicit appointment from the owner of the dough to take off the Challah. The exception to this is if the owner is not around. Let's say he put up some dough. The dough is now rising, and they're not around. And by the time they get back, the dough will already start fermenting too much. It will spoil. And so in that case, if somebody else is around, is able to take off Challah even though they weren't specifically appointed. Paragraph 9. One is not allowed to take off Challah on Shabbos. One of the 39 categories of forbidden creative work of Shabbos is that we're not allowed to fix a kli. It's called Misak Amana. We're not allowed to fix an item. And since this dough cannot be eaten from, or this challah cannot be eaten, the bread cannot be eaten from until we take off this little piece of challah, then by taking it off, it's considered fixing this loaf of bread or fixing this dough. So what should somebody do if they baked bread for Shabbos and they forgot to take off challah, and now it's Friday night, they're about to sit down to the meal, and whoever baked the bread said, "Oh my goodness, I forgot to take off that little piece of challah this afternoon when I was baking the bread. What do you do now?" So in this case, it depends. If you live in Israel, the mitzvah of taking off challah is a biblical mitzvah, and therefore you cannot use these loaves of bread for Shabbos. If you live outside of Israel, then taking off this piece of challah from every dough that we make is only a rabbinical mitzvah. And when they enacted this decree that we have to do outside Israel, they built into a loophole that if Shabbos comes and you forgot to take off that piece of challah before Shabbos, then what you could do is you could eat your challah. It's baked, and like we saw earlier, if you forgot to take it off on this dough, you could take off a piece of the challah, a piece for a challah once it's already baked. So you could eat this challah, but make sure you leave some. You could eat this bread, but make sure you leave over a large enough piece for when after Shabbos is over. You could then to remove challah from that leftover piece that you took that you left behind. So the piece that you're leaving behind, it can't be just a whole loaf, because you have to be leaving behind something which is clear you're leaving behind for the sake of eventually taking off challah. It can't just be a whole loaf of bread that you're leaving behind, but it can't be the exact size to remove a amount of challah, because you have to be taking off challah, the challah amount, which we said was approximately the size of 1 fluid ounce. You have to be taking it off from the bit that you left over. So you have to leave over a nice amount, and then after Shabbos, you'll then take challah off that amount that you left over. Now let's say Shabbos is the day before Passover, the day before Pesach. So now you really have a problem, because when Shabbos is over, in this case, it's going to be the holiday of Pesach. You're not allowed to own any chametz, any leavened bread once Pesach starts. Not only that, on the afternoon before Pesach, you're not allowed to have any leavened bread anymore. So you can't say leave these loaves of bread over until after Shabbos, take off the challah, or leave some bread over, a small piece over till after Shabbos, because when that comes around, you're not allowed to own it even. So what do you do then? So there are different solutions in the halakhic authorities, but no one really has a great solution except what the Magen Avram says. You know what you got to do? You have to give this whole entire loaf of bread to a non-Jew. There's no solution for it. You have to give it all away on the morning before, on Shabbos morning, before you get to the afternoon of Erev Pesach, because once the afternoon hours comes, you're not allowed to own it at all anymore. Chapter 36. Chapter 36 discusses the mitzvah of salting meat, the obligation of salting meat. If you have any sort of meat that was slaughtered properly, whether it's red meat from mammals, whether it's poultry from birds, chicken, whatever it is, it's not even after it's slaughtered properly, it's still not yet kosher. You still can't eat it. First, you have to salt the meat to draw all the blood, because blood is not kosher even in kosher animals, even from kosher animals. Now, the meat that we buy in the store nowadays generally comes pre-salted, so this is not something which the average Jewish home or kosher home has to worry about. At one time, it used to be, probably going back around 40, 50 years, then when you bought meat in the store, it was not salted yet. So every Jewish housewife who was preparing dinner was trained in how to salt meat to get rid of all the blood. Nowadays, when you buy kosher meat in the store, generally it already comes salted. So this has been like a kosher keeping skill, which has become forgotten because it's not done by the average household anymore. So we are going to go through it, but be aware that's not really so practical unless you're out camping and you know how to slaughter meat, and you decide to slaughter your own cow or your own chicken. So then you have to know how to deal with this. But generally, it wouldn't be too relevant, but we're going to go through it anyways because it is a chapter in the Shulchan Aruch. So chapter 1. Once meat is slaughtered, now the first step in getting rid of the blood is soaking the meat in water. You have to soak it in water for approximately half an hour. It has to be fully submerged in the water. And if you see any blood that's stuck to the outside of the piece of meat that you're salting, or that you're preparing to salt at this point at least, then you have to rub it to get rid of that blood off the surface of the meat. Sometimes underneath the skin of the animal, under like the edge of the meat, the surface of the meat at least, there'll be some coagulated blood beneath the surface. So in that case, you have to cut open the surface of the meat to release that blood in order that it will not end up stuck inside that meat. The salting process would not necessarily be able to remove that coagulated blood from the meat. We're supposed to use cool water for soaking the meat. We don't use hot water because hot water could cook the blood into the meat. So it's supposed to be cool water, but it don't have to be cold water because very cold water, then that could end up hardening the meat, making it harder to pull out the blood. Paragraph 2. So you saw that you're supposed to soak the meat in water for half an hour. You don't have to take it out when half an hour is up exactly, but you should take it out soon after that. But you can't let it sit in that water for more than 24 hours because by the time 24 hours passes, then we assume that blood came out into the water. And after 24 hours, during a time of 24 hours, items are able, from a kosher halach perspective, any solid that's in liquid for 24 hours soaks in some of that liquid. So the water will first be pulling out the blood, but now this meat is sitting in bloody water. And if it's there for 24 hours, it's going to be reabsorbing some of that blood. And now you have a problem of how to get that blood out of the meat anymore. Is it possible even? And therefore, this meat does not have a solution how to make it kosher again. So you have to make sure that you're not soaking it more than 24 hours. More than 30 minutes, not more than 24 hours. Paragraph 3. If one is doing this procedure on Erev Shabbos on Friday and there's not so much time until Shabbos and you have to let it soak for half an hour, you might run into Shabbos, you don't have enough time to salt it and cook it, then, says the Shulchan Aruch, you can rinse the meat under running water, but rub it as it's being rub it as the water is pouring over it, and then soak it in water for a short time. Once there's no redness anymore in the water from rinsing it, then at that point you could start the salting process. Paragraph 4. Once you finish soaking the meat, then you're not supposed to cut it up now before doing the salting. If you do cut it up, that might expose some more loose blood, and therefore you have to rinse off that area where you cut before you can start the salting process. Paragraph 5. Let's say you have meat which became frozen. You're not able to salt frozen meat because the point of the salt we're going to see soon is to draw out the blood from the meat. If the meat is frozen, the salt won't be able to draw any blood from it. So what do you do if the meat is frozen? So you have to wait for the meat to thaw. Now you can't put the meat in the oven to thaw because that will cook the meat and it will cook the blood into the meat, in which to a point it will be impossible to remove the blood afterwards. Therefore you can't put the meat into the oven. You could thaw the meat in water, and if needed, if you're in a pressing situation, you could use warm water. Generally, you're not supposed to put this unsalted meat into warm water. But if it's a pressing situation, I guess an example of that be again Friday afternoon or Friday, maybe even not afternoon, where you have to have this meat ready for Shabbos. Then in that case, because pressing situation, you could put this meat into warm water for it to thaw. Paragraph 6. You're supposed to have a separate bowl to soak the meat in. Since this bowl is regularly being used for blood, then there's a concern it won't be cleaned out properly. It's always in contact with the blood, so it might not end up being cleaned properly fully, and therefore we're not supposed to use it for anything else. Paragraph 7. After the meat is soaked, then you can't salt it right away. You first have to dry the meat. You don't want the meat to be fully dry, because if it's fully dry, then you put salt in it, salt will fall right off. But you don't want it to be like soaking wet, because if it's soaking wet, when the salt goes onto it, the salt will dissolve. So you want the salt to stay salt form, salt crystals, but you don't want it to be so dry that they'll just fall off of it. So therefore, you want the meat pretty dry, but not 100% dry. Paragraph 8. The salt which we're using to salt the meat shouldn't be ground too finely like flour, because if so, it will dissolve the second it touches the meat. You don't want it to be ground too coarsely, because if it's too coarse, then it won't stick to the meat. Again, you need to find that balancing act, just like we saw by how wet the meat should be. Over here, you have to find the balancing act of salt crystals that aren't too large or aren't too small. That's what you're going to use to salt your meat with. When you see in the store salt called kosher salt, it's coarser than regular salt. That's the right size salt, the right size grains at least of salt, the right size crystals of salt to use when salting the meat. And that's why it's called kosher salt. Not because it's kosher, almost all salt is kosher. Because it's salt used for koshering your meat by getting rid of the blood. Paragraph 9. You have to make sure that you're salting all sides of the meat. If you're salting a complete chicken or complete bird, you have to make sure that you're not only getting the outside of it, you're getting the inside of it as well. Usually the way that poultry, that chickens, ducks, geese, turkey, etc. is processed is that after it's slaughtered, they then clean out all the insides, all the internal organs. So you're left with the cavity. You have the outside, they have the body, and you have the cavity. The cavity is empty inside. So you have to make sure that you're salting the outside and also the inside of the cavity as well. Paragraph 10. While the meat is salted, you want to make sure it doesn't end up sitting in a puddle of salt of blood. So you either have to use some sort of pan that has holes in it so the blood could drip through the holes. Another option, if using a flat board or a flat pan, to at least have on an incline slanted so that the blood will run off. If you're salting a bird again, like we talked about in last paragraph, then you have to make sure the cavity of the bird is upside down so that it doesn't become like a bowl catching the blood. It has to be upside down so any blood being pulled out by the salt will drip down and away from the bird. This concludes today's episode. Have a wonderful day and see you tomorrow.